Let's turn to our special guest next. US Secretary of State, that's not our special guest, John Kerry is in Sydney next week. Well, he's welcome to come on the program, we should throw that out, for the annual AUSMIN bilateral talks where regional defence and security will be on the agenda. Australia is trying to balance its long-standing alliance with the US and an increasingly important trade relationship with China. Well, a new documentary called Assignment China, Tiananmen Square, explores some of the politics of the US-Sino relationship.
I think to a certain extent we idealize the students to the point where it was a little bit shocking when we discovered that some people who were supposed to be on hunger strike were actually having a meal at the Beijing hotel.
Yet this was never reported at the time.
The media were on the side of the protesters.
It was hard not to be. I mean, to see the idealism, to see the bravery, to see the kind of raw excitement. It was, to be honest, very hard not to get wrapped up in that.
The pressure of deadlines, space limitations, and audiences unfamiliar with China also led many journalists to oversimplify what the students were demanding.
We often, our shorthand was pro-democracy protests. We did try to regularly explain more broadly, what that was shorthand for. And I'm not sure how good a job we did.
Well, the man behind that documentary is Mike Chinoy, CNN's former Asia correspondent. He's a senior fellow at the US-China Institute at the University of Southern California, and he's visiting the US Studies Centre at the Sydney University. Mike, welcome to The Drum.
Thanks for having me.
It's interesting to consider what 1989 meant all these years on. You're arguing, or the colleagues there are arguing, that they misread the situation, mea culpa, in Beijing all those years ago. In hindsight, what did it mean and what's its legacy?
Well, I think, in fairness, people in the heat of a crisis like that got some things wrong, but got quite a lot right as well, I think the film in its entirety, 90 minutes long, explains. But 25 years later, I think there are three really big consequences of Tiananmen Square. One is it really was a wake-up call for the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party. It brought home the dangers of instability, and so I think we've seen a determination by the Communist Party to crack down on dissent, to ramp up the security apparatus, to make sure that nothing like this happens again. At the same time, Deng Xiaoping, who was China's leader at the time, also concluded that China had to restart market-style economic reforms, that he concluded that between Tiananmen and then the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe was partly because they hadn't delivered the economic goods to the people. Right. So one consequence of Tiananmen in the 90s was that they put the button on fast forward, and I think a lot of the dramatic growth that we've seen in China since then comes in large part from that. And the third thing is that the power of the images from Tiananmen Square, images like the photo of the man in front of the tank, which we chronicle in this film, Assignment China, how those images were taken and portrayed, really shaped international perceptions of China and to a large degree continue at some level, particularly in the media, to shape the way people look at China even 25 years later.
Yeah. And there's a question that was raised at the anniversary back in June, and that was to your second point, whether all of this ushered in a new deal along the lines of you give up some civil and political rights and you can be rich, go make yourself rich. I wonder if you buy that and whether you think that deal can hold.
I think that was very much the understanding. The Communist Party said to the Chinese people, you don't challenge our monopoly on political power, and we'll give you opportunities to both to get rich and to have much greater personal freedom than ever before. And I think it's fair to say that while political freedom remains highly constrained in China, the degree of personal freedom that people have to live their lives has been much greater over the last few years than at any time since the Communist Revolution. But of course that requires the Communist Party to keep up with economic growth, and the dramatic social and economic changes that it's produced also create dislocations, internal tensions and problems, and that's what the party leadership is struggling to try and figure out how to deal with now.
Stu?
I think this is a fascinating area. We're seeing China edging its elbows out right across the region. We've seen China go into areas like Vietnam, put an oil rig right down there in Vietnam. So I think it's just a fascinating area. I think internally, obviously our novel, The Mandarin Code, does deal with some of these issues, but at a fictitious level. But I think it's just extraordinary that you've seen within China the rise of this massive middle class of, what, about 200 million. You've seen the internet, which has just basically provided China with the ability to communicate in a way they haven't had before. But at the same time, Beijing is, as Mike said, is wanting to basically control the people. I mean, what does China do with metadata?
Yeah, well, what do they do with metadata? They could define it better than we do.
Anything they like.
I bet they control it.
It's very individualised in China.
The interesting thing is, I suspect we've always thought that as you educate a population, they'll become less and less controllable, shall we say. Do you think that's a real issue in China? Or China's a hugely well-educated society now. Lots of people have been brought out of poverty, are getting really good educations. Can you keep controlling a population with that level of education?
It's a big challenge for China's leaders, because as you become a more modern, developed economy, as you become more integrated with the rest of the world, as you have more and more people studying abroad, here in Australia, in the States, in Europe, people are exposed to different ways of thinking, and this is one of the tensions in the society. How do you manage that? I think that the jury is still out on that process. I think the Communist Party is trying lots of ways to maintain control, but they'll also have to figure out how to do it in such a way that it doesn't so adversely impact the country's development that the economy slows down or that people become really discontented. I mean, I wouldn't want to be the president of China. The kind of problems in your in-basket every day would give you nightmares.
We've got about a minute.
Yeah, so Alan, the main thing I was interested in was your comment about the difference between the expansion of personal freedom and the lack of political freedom. Could you just explain what you actually mean by that in the context of current affairs in China?
In about 30 seconds to our CNN correspondent who'll talk to time, I'm sure.
What that means is that when I first went to China in 1973, the state controlled where you lived, where you worked, to what degree who you could marry, what kind of cultural activities you could participate in, whether you could travel, where you studied. Today, people have enormous freedom to make those choices in a way they never did. What they don't have the freedom to do is to go out in the street and protest.
Mike, thanks so much for coming in and being our guest, and thanks to all the members of the panel. That was a great discussion.